This is the fourth presentation in this series, and it would be the last, except first time I gave this, it went very long, and it seemed best to divide it into two, and so that's what I plan to do here as well. Let me note that if anyone would be interested in discussing these things, please feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to talk. And then also, if anyone would be interested in attending services, there's some information. You would be extremely welcome. And so I'd like to talk about the real history of the world. Often we're told that the universe began 15 billion years ago, and then sometime later the Earth was like a molten blob that gradually cooled, and then billions of years after that, life emerged somehow on the early Earth and then evolved into all the living things that we see around us. But I don't think that's actually what happened, and so I'd like to present a biblical history of the world as well as reasons why I think that is a reasonable view for people to hold. And I'd like to acknowledge that I benefited from numerous sources, both written information and PowerPoint slides, and I don't necessarily agree with every single source on everything, but they were very helpful and I appreciate that. And so let me begin with some questions here. Did God create the worlds in just 6 24-hour days? How many races are there? How did Noah fit all the animals on the ark? What about the dinosaurs? What about radiometric dating? And what did we learn about Specimen Ridge? And so let's begin. According to Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And so the universe had a beginning, as the scriptures and now science also tells us. However, I think it's worth noting that, there was a time when some scientists, probably many, I'm guessing, thought that the universe did not have a beginning, that it was eternal. And there's a model, I think from the 60s, the steady state model. And really, in a sense, I suppose that sort of model would be easier for people who have a naturalistic, purely materialistic worldview to deal with, because one would not have to explain where the universe came from, how it came into existence if the universe was eternal. But Torah scholars, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and according to Spetner, Torah scholars rejected the steady state model, presumably because it clearly conflicted with what we're told in Genesis about the beginning. And I wonder if perhaps they received some ridicule because of that. People saying, oh, you're taking your religious view over this scientific theory, but what happened? Of course, in time, they were vindicated. And as Spetner pointed out, if they had compromised and accepted the steady state view, then they would have had to make a reversal when people accepted the view that the universe did in fact have a beginning. And I think there's a lesson for us in that just because a particular theory may conflict with what the scriptures say doesn't mean we have to abandon the scriptures and accept that theory. Certainly, I don't think that we should. And so in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And as we could see here, God is transcendent, unlike pantheism. That is, God is not his creation. He is outside of, above his creation. He created, he is not the creation, but he is also immanent. In other words, he is present with his creation, unlike deism. Deism holds that God created, but then he doesn't really care. He's not involved with what's going on here or something along those lines. But that's not the case. God is immanent. He is concerned about what is happening here. Well, let me turn to the days of creation very briefly. The first day, God created light. Second day, the sky. Third day, the dry land and plants. Fourth day, the sun, moon, and stars for signs, season, days, years, and to give light on the earth. Fifth day, creatures of the air and sea, including great sea creatures. And my understanding of the Hebrew there is that word would mean something like monsters or dragons, and I find that interesting. Then the sixth day, land animals, Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve were created in God's image, unlike the animals, and were given dominion, that is, the rule over the creation. That, of course, certainly does not mean that one should ruin the creation or anything like that, but rather that one should care for the creation because one is in charge. And that also that they should be fruitful and multiply. The intimate relationship between husband and wife isn't a sinful thing. It was part of God's plan right from the beginning. And they were given plants for food, and God declared that everything was very good. And then, of course, on the seventh day, God rested. Then let's turn to the Garden of Eden. And so, Adam was created, and he was warned not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And Adam named the livestock and the birds and the beasts of the field. And right there, I think we can see that the biblical kind can't be the species, because there would be too many species for him to name. Rather, as we've noticed previously, the biblical kind is probably much more broad than the species usually. And so, for example, different types of wolves and coyotes, different types of foxes, dingoes, and so on are probably all the same biblical kind, even though they're not all the same species. And I think that we could recognize that in this material here as well. But there was no helper suitable for him. There wasn't anyone like him. And so God created Eve from Adam's side. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Now, some might say, I've heard people say this before, there's contradictions between the account in Genesis 1 and the account in Genesis 2. And I don't think that's the case, but let me just note a couple of things here. So, some might say this. After Adam, we're told here, and out of the ground the Lord God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so some might say, well, in Genesis 1, we're told that God created the plants before humans, and yet here we're told out of the ground God made to spring up every tree that is pleasant to sight and good for food. And I don't think that's actually a contradiction, because I don't think that this is all of the plant life that there is on the earth, but rather plant life there, like fruit trees and things for Adam and Eve to eat, things of that nature. And so I don't think that that is all of the plant life, but just speaking specifically of in the garden there. Or how about this one? Now out of the ground the Lord God, and it could say formed or had formed, every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And in some translations it says formed. And so some might say, well, that conflicts, because in Genesis 1 we're told that God created the animals before, or at least some of them before, and yet here in Genesis 2 we're told that they came after. And I think that the solution is that the word there, or words, however it says in the Hebrew, can be translated formed or had formed. And I think it should be translated had formed. Of course, it's also even possible, I think, that God could have created animals and then there in the garden that he made more. I suppose that could perhaps be true. But either way, so I don't think there's a contradiction there between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Here's something interesting. Mitochondrial Eve. And so some of you may have heard about that. In the beginning, it says here, there was Mitochondrial Eve, a woman who lived in Africa between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago and was ancestral to all living humans. And so every person alive today has this individual in their past who the scientists called Eve. And I find this interesting. 2 international teams have found the genetic trail leading to Adam, and it points to the same time and place where Mitochondrial Eve lived. And so I find that interesting as well, that there's that convergence. Moreover, for example, researchers have calculated that Mitochondrial Eve, the woman whose mitochondrial DNA was ancestral to that in all living people, lived 100,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. Using the new clock, she would be a mere 6,000 years old. And so I find that quite thought-provoking as well, consistent with what the scriptures tell us. And so then all human beings are related, and they're all related through our parents of long ago, Adam and Eve, and they're not separate races. It's not that some races are closer to, some non-human ancestor than others, or something along those lines. We are all human beings. Now one might ask, well, what about all the differences between different groups of people, like skin color, for example, which of course people seem to pay a lot of attention to. And it's worth noting that if parents have variability in their genes that are related to melanin, that is, I take it, the primary thing that determines how dark your skin is, then you can get quite a bit of variability in their offspring, as you can see here. And here's an interesting incident that sort of is consistent with that. And so these two parents here had twins, and as you can see, one of the twins is quite light and one of the twins is quite dark. Well, we could turn to what is a day? What is meant by a day in Genesis 1? The word for day is yom. And I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I understand yom often means a day. It means a regular day. It can mean a period of time, and so one has to consider the context, which of course one generally needs to do with regard to biblical interpretation. And so here's an interesting statement, I think, by Ken Ham. Back in my father's day, it took 10 days to drive across the Australian outback during the day. And so the word day here is used 3 times, and yet it means different things. Back in my father's day, well, that means back in my father's time. 10 days, that is 10 regular days, to drive across the Australian outback during the day. That is the light part of the day. And so day can mean different things depending upon the context. And so we need to look at the context there in Genesis 1. First of all, we could note that it has the phrase evening and morning. And that indicates, of course, an ordinary day, something with an evening and a morning. Then also it has a number, like the first day, or the second day, or the third day. And that also indicates that it's an ordinary day. As we could see here, evening and morning, evening and morning, evening and morning, the first day, the second day, the third day. I like what Ken Ham said here. I got a strong hint there. Did you get a strong hint there? Evening, morning, number, evening, morning, number. I've got a feeling God's trying to tell us something. Evening, morning, number, evening, morning, number. It is an ordinary day. How else could you say it's an ordinary day? Now, of course, some have attempted to reconcile the Genesis account with the idea of an old earth. And there are a number of different ways that people have tried to do this. Let me just mention a couple of them and what I think is wrong with them. So some would hold to the day-age theory. They would say, okay, well, there were 6 days, but they were millions and millions of years long each, or something along those lines. And they might point to this passage here. With the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. Of course, indicating that God is outside of time. That whether it's a day or whether a day passes or 1,000 years pass is no trouble for him. But that doesn't really have to do with the interpretation of Yom in Genesis 1. We're supposed to look at the context there in Genesis 1 to determine what Yom is telling us there. Plus, that would mean that there was death before sin, because things would be living and dying long before Adam and Eve got there, and long before sin came into the world. And so that would be a problem. And then the order of the events is different. The earth and the sun. In the biblical account, the earth appears before the sun. But in the evolutionary model, the sun comes long before the earth. Plants and the sun. In the biblical account, plants actually occur before the sun. God had created light before he created the sun. Plants and sea creatures. Evolutionary model says life began in the sea. Biblical model says, no, plants came first. And so, even if one were to say that the days are long periods of time, that wouldn't really solve the problem about the conflict between the evolutionary model and the biblical one. Or what about this one, the framework hypothesis? As I understand it, the framework hypothesis basically says that, well, this is kind of not to be taken literally. That it's just a figurative account, it's speaking metaphorically and things like that. There are lessons that we should draw from it, but it isn't necessarily intended to be taken literally, and so we ought not to. Well, but you know, the book of Genesis is a book of history. It eventually goes on to talk about Noah and then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so on. When does it become real history? You know, if people think Abraham is a real individual and those events are true, then how is it when does it stop being figurative and when does it become real history? So I think that would be a problem for the framework view. And then I think it's worth noting that, people might say, well, some religious people used to think that the sun revolved around the earth, and they ended up changing their mind with regard to that. And of course, that is true, but I think that it is understandable for people to say things like the sun rises, because that's the way it looks. And so I think it makes sense for the Bible to talk about the sun rising and setting or things like that, because we still do the exact same thing today. It looks like the sun is rising and it looks like the sun is setting, and so I don't think it's making a statement there about the relationship between the sun and the earth. Or what about this one? God said that he would make two great lights. And someone might say, oh, well, the moon isn't really giving light. It's just reflecting light from the sun. Well, I don't really think that's a problem either, because we still say moonlight, even today. Do we mean that the moon itself is shining? No, I don't think we mean that the moon is shining. We just say moonlight because that's the way it looks. And so I think that those sorts of things are totally understandable for it to be described in that way. But how do 6 days look like the evolutionary model? For people who want to hold the evolutionary model, it seems like they would have to say, well, the 6 days represent this or that or what? It doesn't seem like that would fit very well. They don't look like the evolutionary model in any way that I can see. Well, let's turn to the fall. And so Adam and Eve ate the fruit that they were forbidden from eating, and sin and death entered the world. And sin has spiritual consequences. It separates people from God, and Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, away from God's presence in that sense. But I think it's also important to note that sin also had physical consequences as well, that it affected the entire creation. In this passage here in Romans, we find phrases like this: the creation subjected to futility, the creation in bondage to corruption, the whole creation groaning. And I think it's worth noting, what is the creation? It's everything that was created, right? To the farthest star and beyond. And so sometimes I think people don't recognize the full impact of the fall. They think, oh, Adam and Eve did wrong and they were cast out of the garden and that's it. No, the whole creation was affected. And so it had very serious spiritual consequences, but it also had serious physical consequences as well. And so if people look around this world and they go, well, this doesn't look like the world that God would have created, it's got these problems and things like that, of course they're right, because this is not the way God created the world originally. Then we could turn to Cain and Abel. So Adam and Eve had children. Cain and Abel brought offerings to God, and God had regard for Abel and his offering, which was by faith, we're told in Hebrews 11, but not for Cain and his offering. And Cain was angry about that. And God said here, if you do well, will you not be accepted? And I find that to be very important to recognize. Isn't that the message throughout the scriptures? If you do well, will you not be accepted? It's not like God wants to reject people or things like that. If you do well, will you not be accepted? But unfortunately, Cain didn't react as he ought to have. Cain murdered his brother Abel and went away from God. And we're told about Cain's wife. And I'm not sure I've ever heard anyone ask me this question, but I take it some people ask that question about, well, where did Cain get his wife? Did God create other people that we're not told about or something like that? I don't actually think it's very difficult at all to explain. Who was Cain's wife? Well, in Genesis 5 verse 4, we're told that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. And so I presume that Cain's wife was one of his sisters or one of his other close relatives, like a niece or something like that. Close intermarriage was not forbidden until later in Leviticus, I think. And people back then did not have as many mutations and genetic problems that we have today, and so it would not have been a problem in the way that it would be now. Then before the flood, so after Cain and Abel, but before the flood, more than 1,000 years goes by. And I think it's worth noting that people were not primitive, as someone said. They're not, primitive creatures dragging their knuckles on the ground on the way up to being human, or something like that. They built cities, had livestock, they played musical instruments. Now, of course, they didn't have the technology that we do, but as you probably know, technology is the result of accumulated knowledge. It builds on the things that other people have done before, and so as time goes by, technology tends to grow. But with regard to raw intellect, personally, I think that they were more intelligent than we. They were smarter than we, even though they had less technology than we do. But people became evil, and God was grieved about that. And so God decided to send a flood. I think it's worth noting that baptism is likened to that flood in 1 Peter 3:21, just as the flood washed away sin, so baptism is like that as well. But Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation, and Noah walked with God. And so he was instructed to build an ark to save himself and others who would come, and animals as well. And we're told that he was a preacher of righteousness, so I presume that means that he tried to convince other people to come into the ark, but unfortunately most people didn't listen to him. He took 2 of every kind of animal, 7 of some. He didn't have to go gather them. God made them come to him. Well, how did Noah fit in all the animals? One might think he couldn't have fit all the animals into the ark. And I think that actually it wouldn't have been difficult for him to do that. Let's notice a few things. One is we need to consider again the biblical kind. The biblical kind is not the species. And so, like I've mentioned, wolves, coyotes, foxes are probably all the same biblical kind. And so there are far fewer kinds than there are species. Some estimate only 16,000 animals had to go on the ark, maybe even fewer than that. Plus, it would be sensible to take juveniles, because, as you recall, after they get out of the ark, then they have to reproduce and things like that, and multiply and fill the earth again. And so it would make sense to take juveniles who are going to have more of their reproductive life, and of course juveniles would be smaller. Plus, the ark was huge. Sometimes I think people have a view of the ark something like this, but of course it wasn't like that at all. This is the actual dimensions that are described for us. And as you can see here down at the bottom, able to hold more than 125,000 sheep-size animals. And as we noticed before, probably no more than 16,000 were actually needed, maybe even fewer than that. And so, plenty of room for animals on the ark. And so here's an illustration, perhaps, of people and animals going into the ark. And as you'll notice, there's dinosaurs there as well. And I'd like to focus on that here for a moment. Some people might think, well, it's absurd to think that humans and dinosaurs ever lived together, that humans ever saw a living dinosaur or anything like that. But actually, I think that there's evidence that we can point to that suggests that is in fact what happened. And so let's consider some things about dinosaurs. Created on day 6, because dinosaurs, I understand, are land animals. I believe dinosaur-like creatures that lived in the sea, like Kronosaurus or Plesiosaurs or things like that, I think are not technically regarded as dinosaurs, even though we kind of think of them that way. And so they were taken on the ark, and most dinosaurs, of course, were not large. And there were only about 50 kinds, I understand, of dinosaurs, and also juveniles, as we've noticed. It would make sense to take young dinosaurs. And I think there's some evidence that we can point to about people actually seeing dinosaurs. Let me give you some things. Like Behemoth, which is described for us in Job 40. We're not told what this creature is. And so I find that interesting right away, that we're not told, if it was intended to be an elephant or whatever, why didn't they just say elephant, or something like that. And so we're not told what this creature is, Behemoth. And of course the word dinosaur wasn't invented until much later on. And so that could be a dinosaur. Also Leviathan in Job 41, I think, is worth looking at there. Ancient stone carvings or paintings of dinosaurs. According to the evolutionary model, no one ever saw a dinosaur. Primitive people who lived thousands of years ago didn't see a dinosaur. And yet, we see some things. I hope to show you some. Then dragon legends. There's legends of dragons all over the world. Could be that those legends are based upon actual real creatures. And then this one, really interesting. Soft T-Rex tissue that has been found recently. And so there's a petroglyph, and it kind of looks like it could be a dinosaur. Or that one there. Or this one in the top, it's not real easy to see, although I think you can see it if you look closely, but just in case you want to see it better, there's the outline. And then, of course, with regard to legends like St. George and the Dragon, maybe there was actually some sort of creature, a dinosaur. And then this is really interesting. So unfossilized T-Rex. So scientists find this soft tissue in a T-Rex bone supposedly 70 million years ago. And so soft tissue really lasted buried in the ground for 70 million years? Sure doesn't seem very likely. Then we could turn to the flood. And so in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. And it's always struck me as interesting that it's a particular day. 600th year of his life, second month, 17th day. Probably seemed just like a regular day. People probably got up and were doing the kinds of things that they normally did. I think Jesus talked about how they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, just like any other day, except it wasn't like any other day. Everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was a breath of life died. But eventually the waters receded and the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. I believe that's in modern-day Turkey. And God called Noah, his family, and all the animals from the ark. And Noah offered sacrifices to the Lord. And God put the fear of man in animals. And I think it's worth noting that even today, animals that could easily kill a human, like a lion or a tiger, will often, I understand, run from humans. And so that's consistent with that, I think. And gave people the right to eat meat. Previously, of course, back in the garden, he had given them the right to eat plants. However, not given the right to eat the blood. And God promised to never send another flood to destroy all flesh, and he put a bow in the clouds, the rainbow, as a sign of the covenant. And there's a particularly beautiful picture. Well, there are accounts of a great flood all over the world, like in those cultures there. Where'd all those accounts of a great flood come from? Well, what if there was a great flood? And then, of course, that would be handed down and perhaps changed over the course of time in some societies and that kind of thing, but the true account given to us in the scriptures. Well, what would we expect, geologically speaking, from a catastrophic worldwide flood? As Ken Ham has said, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And what do we find? Of course, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And so we find fossils. I think that's an ichthyosaur, looks like. Mass graveyards, where many animals seem to have been killed, buried together. There's an interesting one, the coelacanth, as you might have heard, once thought to have been extinct millions and millions of years ago until they were found, still alive. Well, what about the fossil record? I think a lot of people have the idea that the fossil record is a real strong point for the evolutionary model. That, in fact, is not the case. Let me give you some information here. And so, Stephen Jay Gould, who passed away not all that long ago, but probably one of the most famous paleontologists and evolutionists in America. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability even in our imagination to construct functional intermediates in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution. And then let me note that Gould later said that the primary features of the fossil record are these two things: sudden appearance and stasis, or a lack of change. They appear suddenly and don't change. He said, in short, if evolution means the gradual change of one kind of organism into another kind, the outstanding characteristic of the fossil record is the absence of evidence for evolution. Now, of course, as some of you may know, he has his own idea about how to explain that, his idea of punctuated equilibrium, but certainly the fossil record doesn't look like the way it should have according to the Darwinian type perspective. Then this one here, David Ropp, at least at one time of the University of Chicago and the Field Museum. A large number of well-trained scientists outside of evolutionary biology and paleontology have unfortunately gotten the idea that the fossil record is far more Darwinian than it is. This probably comes from the oversimplification inevitable in secondary sources, low-level textbooks, semi-popular articles, and so on. Also, there's probably some wishful thinking involved. In the years after Darwin, his advocates hoped to find predictable progressions. In general, these have not been found, yet the optimism has died hard, and some pure fantasy has crept into textbooks. Well, let's turn to the Tower of Babel. So after the flood, all people had one language, and some settled on this plain and began to build, saying, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves." Sounds a little bit like pride there. "Lest we be dispersed over the face of the earth, of the whole earth." And so God confused their language and dispersed them around the earth, and the city was called Babel, like babbling, because of the confusion there. Then I think it's worth noting the decrease in lifespan. People before the flood lived to great ages. Methuselah, I think, being the oldest one recorded, 969 years. And Noah himself lived to be 950 years old. But then we see this decreasing of lifespan after that. So Terah, Abram's father, lived to be only 205, and then lifespans have decreased even more since then. And I think that's really interesting to think about. Why might that be? One possible explanation, it seems, would be the accumulation of mutations. Perhaps that's partially responsible for what is going on there. And here's a graph from Sanford's book, Sanford, a geneticist. And so, as you look at this graph, essentially what it's telling us is that most mutations are negative. That's all that stuff off to the left side of the graph, that curve. And that little tiny curve at the very bottom of the right-hand side is supposed to reflect any beneficial mutations that there might be. But Sanford said, I can't really draw this for you to see it as small as it should actually be. But anyway, kind of the point of this distribution is, notice the gray area. The gray area there in the middle, that box, is to reflect the fact that some things are so minor, either negative or positive, they're so minor that they're not really subject to natural selection because they don't really make enough of a difference. And so essentially what this is telling us is there are some mutations that are so bad that they're selected against because they cause serious problems. But many mutations are still minor that they're not really affected by natural selection. They can't really be eliminated by natural selection. And so if they're not eliminated by natural selection, what does that mean? Then that would seem to suggest that they're going to be accumulating. And so as time goes by, more and more mutations are accumulating, and so essentially we're deteriorating as a species. Well, look at this in light of that. Here's the declining lifespan with regard to descendants of Noah. Here's the curve here about declining fitness because of mutations, and then look at that. Boy, I find that thought-provoking. Well, very quickly, eventually, kind of we focus in on this one individual, Abram, later called Abraham, and then Isaac, his son, and Jacob, and then whose name was changed to Israel, and then Joseph, so patriarchs. Then, of course, a period of Egyptian bondage, and then they were delivered by God, who brought them out with a mighty hand. Law of Moses was given to them at Mount Sinai. Then, unfortunately, they wouldn't go into the Promised Land. Most of them didn't think that they could do it, and so they had to wander in the wilderness, but eventually entered Canaan under Joshua. Then a period of the judges, like Gideon and Deborah. Kings, like Saul and David and Solomon. Then the kingdom was divided, and eventually the northern kingdom of Israel was carried away by Assyria, basically never to return. And Judah was carried away by Babylon, but they return some individuals return under Ezra and Nehemiah. Then there's the silent years, so close of the Old Testament writings, so the silent years with regard to written books from God. And there's this individual, Antiochus, who apparently did some very unpleasant things and looked like he was trying to destroy Judaism, for lack of a better way to put it. And there was the revolt under the Maccabean revolt, and I believe Israel was independent until kind of conquered by Rome. And then, of course, we have the appearance of Jesus Christ, preceded by a messenger, John the Baptist, and then the spread of Christianity. And so let me stop there, but I hope to continue in part 2.